Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today's Sprintax session on the core areas that you need to know about non-resident tax. My name is Ryan Ludden, and I'm from the Sprintax team. And I'm also joined today by my colleagues Anna Fitzpatrick from the Sprintax team.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to today's session.
So for many of you today might be the first time you're tuning into a tax related webinar for US taxes. Some of you might have tuned in today for another refresher if you've been a current international student or scholar. But in both cases, I think there's going to be some useful information, whether this is the first time you're learning about US taxes or whether you have been a little bit used to dealing with US taxes in the past. Before we jump into the session, just some general housekeeping. We will make a recording available to attendees. We've had a large number of registrations, so we'll be sending out recordings to everyone who's registered. There is a chat function. Our team will do our best to answer questions in the chat. What I would say there is, please maybe wait until later on towards the end of the session before using the chat. There's likely a lot of topics that we'll already cover throughout this session. Also, disclaimer, we do have to show this disclaimer to outline that this is to give you a general understanding of tax principles, but do keep in mind that tax is individual to you. Everyone has a unique tax position, so this is here just to give you with a general understanding. So what will we cover today? We'll look at first an overview of tax filing obligations for non-resident students and scholars. So looking kind of ahead to next tax filing season. We'll also then break into some guidance around any of you that might be starting employment in the US, or maybe you're receiving some US taxable income like scholarships, for example. So we'll give some guidance around that area as well. And then we'll jump kind of back into tax filing and maybe the implications of not filing or misfiling. And we'll finish up with some of the Sprintax solutions that help with tax compliance. And then we'll open the floor for some Q&A towards the end. So where to start? If we're looking ahead, the 2021 tax filing season obviously won't begin until late January 2022, as that will look at everything that's happened between the 1st of January 2021 through to the 31st of December 2021. So all of the time that you'll have spent on US soil during this tax year, all of the US source income that you've earned during this tax year, that's what you will be looking at when it comes to tax filing season, which kicks off in early 2022. And the filing deadline for the upcoming tax filing season will be, as it stands, Friday, April 15th, 2022. So of course, there's still a bit of time, before tax filing season kicks off, but hopefully this session will help educate you on some key areas to look out for ahead of that. And one of those first key areas is the whole concept of residency for tax purposes. You might be thinking, what on earth does this mean? And I suppose it's important to know that generally most international students and scholars who are on F, J, M, or Q visas are considered as non-resident for tax purposes by the IRS, the US tax authorities, for a certain period of time. And basically what that means is, as a non-resident for tax, different tax laws are going to apply to you versus maybe your American roommates or co-workers. And you'll also need to complete different tax forms than them as a result in most cases. If you're an international student on an F1 or J1 student visa, you're automatically considered a non-resident for tax purposes for the first 5 calendar years in the US. For any of you that are scholars or researchers and dependents on J visas, you're automatically considered non-residents for 2 tax years out of the last 6 years in the US. So if you've been in America for longer than the 5-year period, if you're an international student, or 2-year period if you're maybe a scholar, researcher, professor, then your days start counting towards what's called the substantial presence test. And this sounds like a crazy science experiment, but essentially when your days start counting, you'll need to count all of the days of presence in the US for the current year. You'll add that to 1/3 of the days of presence in the US the year before that, and you'll add those days to 1/6 of the days of presence in the US the year before that. If it totals to 183 days, you'll generally be deemed a resident for tax purposes. Now, the good news here is that the Sprintax software will actually do this thinking for you when it goes live for 2021 tax season around January or February of 2022. In case I missed out on any other visa categories, you'll see on the left here the type of visa, on the right the number of years exempt from counting your days towards that substantial presence test. So we do also want to learn a little bit more about you all. So in your opinion, and don't worry if you don't know, who needs to file tax documents to the IRS as a non-resident for tax purposes? Do you think that all non-residents need to file something regardless of whether or not they earned income? Do you think only those who earned US income need to file? Maybe you think non-residents don't have to file any tax documents, or maybe you're unsure, and that's okay too.
I'll give everyone a second or two more, but looking like the majority are correct here, which is great to see. Okay, great. So 52% of attendees today thinking that all non-residents need to file something regardless of income. So well done to you. That's the correct option. 41% thinking that only those who earned US income need to file. 1% thinking non-residents don't need to file any tax documents, and 5% are a little bit unsure.
Great. Brilliant to hear that many of you got it right. So basically your answer is out here on the screen in terms of who must file for 2021. Well, if you're a non-resident for tax purposes, then most non-residents that are on F, J, M, or Q visas must complete at least one simple tax form, which is called Form 8843, regardless of whether or not they earned US source income. So if you were present during 2021 in the US as a non-resident for tax purposes, Form 8843 is the minimum tax form you need to send to the IRS. In terms of who needs to file an actual federal income tax return to the IRS, the rule there is simple. If you received any taxable earnings or income from US sources over $0 during 2021, then you need to file a federal tax return, which is the 1040 NR for non-residents. So at a minimum, you'll need to file Form 8843. If you've earned US source income during the year, you'll need to file a federal return, which is the 1040 NR. But the minimum Form 8843, it's a minimum filing requirement, a statement for exempt individuals and individuals with a medical condition. Essentially, it's a very simple statement to the IRS declaring your non-resident status. You're telling the IRS that you're, for example, an F1 student, and please don't count your days towards a substantial presence test because you're still exempt from having your days counted if you're within, let's say, that 5-year rule for F1 or J1 students, or perhaps 2-year rule for scholars, researchers, teachers, professors. Many of you on this call may be receiving US source income at the moment, or may begin to start receiving US income maybe as you start your employment. And the most common types of US income across the US are employment, where maybe you're working on campus, working for the school, or on OPT. But you might also have other sources of income like taxable scholarships that cover costs other than your tuition. For example, room and board allowances, stipends, grants, they're generally considered as taxable and a type of US income. You might also be investing or be selling or trading cryptocurrencies, or other areas you might have had gambling winnings during the year. You might be participating in focus groups in receipt of an Amazon gift card for that, or you might have rental income. So there's a lot of different types of US source income. So maybe try and think outside of just employment when you think about types of income in the US. Now, some income that don't have filing implications for non-residents, we've broken them down below. The first is your scholarship for tuition and tuition-related expenses. So if you're receiving a scholarship that just covers your tuition, this is generally non-taxable and non-reportable. Next one is a scholarship received from outside of the US. So if your school back in France or India were actually paying for you to study in the US, that's generally seen as foreign source income. It's not uncommon as well that your parents or relatives will transfer money from overseas to help with the cost of living. That's generally seen as foreign source income, won't trigger a filing requirement. Any income that you earned in your home country, maybe you were working back in France or India or China, or had some income during the year from your home country, as long as you're a non-resident for tax purposes, the IRS will not look at your worldwide income. And finally, interest on a regular savings account in the US, it probably won't even buy you a cup of coffee, unfortunately, but generally doesn't have tax implications. So, when we speak about all the different types of US source income, it's very likely that depending on what income you're earning, it will be reflected on any of these three types of income documents. So these are income documents that you will generally receive at the end of the tax year. And if you receive these income documents, you'll very likely need them when filing your income tax returns. The first is your W-2, and this reflects things like your wages, salary, or compensation that you earned during 2021. You'll typically expect to receive this from your employer at the end of January 2022. Next is the 1042-S income document. This will cover anything like taxable scholarships that you receive from your school during the year, or else if you were working, you might have some part of your income exempt due to what's called a tax treaty, and that's generally reported on a 1042-S as well. If you had royalty payments or prizes or awards, you generally expect to see them on a 1042-S. Finally, the 1099 series covers areas like rental income or investment income, cryptocurrency, or work as an independent contractor. So don't worry, you won't be receiving those income documents most likely at the moment. You'll probably be getting them towards the end of the tax year so that you'll be able to use them on when filing your income tax returns during the upcoming filing season. When it comes to non-resident spouses and dependents, we often say, unfortunately, no matter how long you've been together, no matter how much you love each other, as two non-residents in the US, you cannot file jointly on your US tax return. So you'll be treated separately by the IRS. You'll file your own Form 8843, and if you've got a federal filing obligation, you'll also need to file the 1040-NR separately as well. The only way you could file jointly on a US tax return is if you are married to a resident for tax purposes. In that case, you have the option to either file separately as a non-resident, or you can decide to file jointly on the resident return if you're married to a tax resident. Also think about state taxes, and this is something that the Sprintax software will do for you later on in the upcoming filing season, is that you may also trigger a state tax filing obligation. So whilst there is federal taxes in the US, there are also local kind of state tax rules and laws. So around 43 states have state income taxes. Some don't have state taxes at all, and you may trigger an obligation to have to file a state return when it comes to your end of year tax filing, when it comes to tax filing season in early 2022. So that covers a lot of the kind of tax filing requirements for 2021 season. The next part of this session is going to take a look at scenarios where you might be starting employment as we speak, or might be receiving US income during this year, and what you might need to think about there, as well as the tax implications. So the first thing I would start off with is that federal income tax, would be that IRS generally requires federal income tax withholding on all or most US source payments to non-resident alien students. So international students are generally taxed on your wages at what's called graduated rates. And this basically means that the rate of tax increases depending on your income level. And that ranges from 10% all the way through to 37%. There are tax treaties with over 65 countries around the world and the US that might help to actually reduce the rate of tax withholding, or it might exempt some of your income from federal tax withholding. And you may also have to pay state tax on your income depending on where you live in the US and your own circumstances. So there are some things to think about when you're looking at your paycheck. You'll very likely have federal taxes withheld, and depending on your circumstances, you might also have state taxes withheld on your paycheck. You might also notice Social Security or Medicare taxes being withheld. It's unlikely that you'll have this withheld as if you're getting paid by the school, but Social Security or Medicare usually falls under this umbrella called FICA taxes. And it's something to be aware of if you are working. It's most common to pop its head up if you're on OPT or CPT. But non-resident international students and scholars that are J1 and F1 are exempt from paying FICA taxes. So do keep that in mind. Might be something you need to make aware of with your employer. But also notice that H1B, J2, F2 and TN visa holders are subject to FICA taxes from their first day of employment. If you are having FICA taxes withheld in error, the first thing to do is to approach your employer about it, to ask them to refund the FICA taxes back to you. If they refuse, you can prepare a FICA return with the IRS. And maybe to put this into a little bit more perspective, here's a comparison of the impact of FICA taxes on employees where taxes have been withheld in error. So if you look on the right here, we've got a couple of different visa categories. We've got F1 students, J1 interns, J1 researchers, all earning a different level of wages. And you can see that if they've had FICA taxes withheld in error as a non-resident, below shows the amount of FICA taxes that could be withheld from your overall pay that shouldn't have had to have been withheld. So you can see that it's noticeable for sure. That can range from $1,500 at someone who's earning $20,000 during the year, all the way up to something, to close to $4,000 if you are earning around $50,000 a year. So that is money that you'd rather in your own pockets than trying to chase down with your employer or the IRS. Because what I would say is, if you do need to prepare a FICA return to get those taxes back, it can take a long time to do that with the IRS. The next topic is tax treaties, and it's important to know that the US has income treaties with over 65 different countries around the world that help to reduce the level of tax withholding on certain types of income, or it might exempt some portions of your income from tax withholding entirely. And whether or not they are applicable to someone is based off 4 primary factors. One is your visa type, the type of income that you're receiving, the work that you're being compensated for, and the duration of time in the US. There's other factors involved there, but these are maybe some of the core areas to look at. And it's important to know that some states honor the US tax treaties, but some states don't. So whilst you may have treaty benefits at a federal level, you might have some states that don't recognize the tax treaty at a state level. And here's another comparison of the impact of tax treaties on employees. So let's say you are an F1 student from India or an F1 student from China. You can see here the tax treaties that are available. There are tax treaties for both of those countries. And then you can see if everyone was earning the same amount, $30,000 in wages, an Indian student can use the standard deduction of $12,550. So your taxable wages would actually only be $17,450. For a Chinese student, they can exempt the first $5,000 from tax withholding, and their taxable wages effectively are 25,000 rather than the higher 30,000. Now, in order to uh, apply a tax treaty benefit, there are documents that are required to provide to your employer or your payer. As you can see here below, India is a little bit different to the rest of the nationalities, where they have a standard deduction, so they just fill out a W4. But for a Chinese F1 student, for example, if there was a tax treaty available for a compensation during studying and training, they would typically need to provide a signed 8233 form to their employer. So that jumps into our key tax forms overview here. These forms might not mean a lot to you looking at them from the first time, and I promise you that they didn't look, I didn't understand them when I saw them for the very first time as an international student. So we've tried to break them down here just to give you more information around what each form does. So if you're starting employment, it's very likely that your employer will ask you to provide, to fill out a W4. And basically it helps your employer to deduct the correct amount of federal taxes from your pay if you are working. So it's important to know that non-residents fill this out a little differently than someone who is a US citizen or a resident for tax purposes. So keep that in mind, that you do fill this out a little differently as a non-resident versus a resident for tax purposes. What is the 8233? This is used to claim a tax treaty-based exemption from tax withholding on things like your compensation during studying and training, if you're receiving personal services or employment income. It'll report kind of the country, tax treaty article, the amount of exempt income, your citizenship, and more. You will complete this form, you will sign it, and you will then provide it to your payer. If they are going to apply the tax treaty, they will need to send that form to the IRS. If you don't provide the 8233 form, it's very likely you won't have a tax treaty benefit applied to your employment income. Lastly, the W8 BEN. This is mostly used for claiming tax treaty benefits on scholarship income or perhaps royalties or other passive income. It also certifies your foreign status. And this too helps to kind of report reduced tax rates under any tax treaties between your home country and the US. It's signed and provided to your payer. This typically will reduce the rate of tax withholding on your scholarship if your FJ MRQ from 14% down to 0%. If you don't provide it, it's very likely that you'll have 14% taxes withheld on your scholarship, or that could go up to 30% if you are on other categories of visa. So we'll give you maybe one scenario here to put this all together, because I know we've covered a lot there, and that can be maybe feel a little bit heavy. So let's just give a scenario of someone who's about to start their on-campus employment. So we have an individual here, Zhang Wei, who has arrived from China on her F1 student visa. She's here for the very first time in the US and started work as a library assistant for the school. She's allowed to work and she's already received her social security number. So on the right hand side, let's have a look at how Zhang could be taxed in 2021. From a residency for tax purposes, Zhang is considered a non-resident for tax purposes because she's still in her first year on her F1 visa status. F1 student visas are allowed 5 years where they're considered non-resident for tax purposes. The income that Zhang is receiving, she's working as a library assistant, so wages paid to her are considered compensation during studying and training, or the IRS would classify this as income code 20. In terms of the tax forms, if you skip that for a second and run down to tax treaty determination, we can see that Zhang can earn up to the first $5,000 in compensation tax-free for compensation during studying and training, provided it's within the first 5 years of their study. So Zhang will need to provide an 8233 for the income that is exempt under the Chinese tax treaty. She'll also need to provide a W4 with the NRA filled out as an NRA for any of the non-qualified income. And then any income covered by the treaty is taxed at 0%, and the rest of that income is taxed at that graduated rate for federal tax purposes, as we mentioned. Then at the end of the year, Zhang should receive 2 income tax documents from her employer. The 1042S income document will cover income that was exempt by a tax treaty, and the W2 document will cover the rest of the income that wasn't exempt as a result of the treaty. So that covers the employment example there. What I would also say is that many of you might also be receiving taxable scholarships. And generally scholarships that just cover your tuition or books or materials necessary for your course of study are non-taxable and non-reportable as a degree candidate and full-time student. However, if you receive scholarship or grants that are not directly related to tuition, then these may very likely be taxable and reportable on a 1042S income document. So do keep that in mind. Some examples there are housing, food, travel, stipends, grants, or awards. And most non-residents on F, J, M, or Q visas are usually subject to 14% tax withholding on your taxable scholarship. If you do have a tax treaty that exempts your scholarship from tax withholding, you would generally need to complete and sign a W8 Ben and provide that to your payer if you are eligible for a treaty that can reduce that level of tax withholding from 14% to 0. And if you are a scholarship recipient who isn't going to be working or is not eligible for a social security number, the ITIN is something that may be relevant to you. So this is an individual taxpayer identification number. You need a tax identification number when you're filing a tax return. So if you've got a social security number or are applying for a social security number, you don't need to worry about this form. It's also not needed if you just need to file Form 8843. But if you are receiving things like taxable scholarship or other forms of income, but you don't have a social security number, you may need to apply for this ITIN with the IRS. We have released an ITIN blog for further information if this is relevant to you, and you can find that on the link below. So many of you also might be looking at investments or trading. So do keep in mind that this certainly can have tax implications. There's realized versus unrealized gains. If you have realized a gain, it's treated as income. If you haven't realized a gain, it's generally not treated as income. So, if you're making a gain on your investments, that's when there's generally taxable implications. And this can be a short-term gain or a long-term gain. That's described as a sale within 12 months would be taxed as a short-term gain. Over 12 months would be taxed as a long-term gain. And you would generally get a 1099 income document from your investment vehicle, maybe your broker, whomever you are investing through at the end of the tax year. And that will need to be outlined on your federal income tax return or your 1040 NR. Similarly, cryptocurrency is coming up quite a lot as well. So maybe to prepare you for what are the implications there, generally you need to report crypto if you did any of the following. If you converted cryptocurrency to a regular currency like US dollars, if you used it to pay for goods or services, if you sold cryptocurrency, or maybe you received kind of free coins through fork or an airdrop, receiving free coins or tokens for, say, new virtual currency. That can be common as well. In terms of how it's treated from a tax perspective, it's essentially treated as a sale of property, and it's subject to what's called capital gains tax of 30%. It's also important to know that if you're paid in Bitcoin for work done as a self-employed person, this will count as personal services income and is generally reported on a Form W2. So we've covered information about the upcoming tax season. We've covered some common scenarios for folks that are about to start employment or receiving US income. The next couple of slides outline some guidance around what might happen if you filed incorrectly, and also cover the stimulus checks that might be relevant to some of you who have been previously filing tax returns over the years. Before we do that, we might launch our second poll, which is whether you think you've ever filed an incorrect US tax return. Maybe that's yes, maybe no, maybe you didn't misfile, but you forgot to file for previous years, or for many of you, it might be your first year in the USA.
Great, thanks everyone for your engagement. I'll give everyone another second or two and then I'll reveal the results. Great, so the majority, with 67%, it's their first year in the US. 8% didn't misfile but forgot to file for previous years. 18% no, have not filed an incorrect tax return in the past, and the remaining 7% have filed an incorrect tax return in the past.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Anna. For any of those smaller percentages that have missed a year or filed as a resident by mistake, this might help. As I always say, don't panic, but do set the record straight. If you've never filed, you can always catch up and file returns for previous years. You can backfile at any stage, and you can claim a refund from the IRS if it's been within the last 3 years. If you've misfiled, maybe you filed as a resident for tax purposes, you would need to amend your tax return, and that's called a 1040X, an amended US income tax return. The good news is that Sprintax can help to prepare amended returns. We've helped over 5,000 international students to correct and amend their returns when they incorrectly filed through things like TurboTax or other resident tax softwares. So don't worry if you have filed incorrectly, help is on hand. And somewhat related to that, if you have been in the US in the past, over the last 1 or 2 years, stimulus checks were released from the IRS for folks that had filed as a resident for tax purposes. So those who maybe filed incorrectly were also getting these payments from the government that weren't intended for them. So there was 3 stimulus checks over the last year or two, and generally non-resident aliens won't qualify for those payments if you are a non-resident alien for tax purposes for those tax years. As I said, Sprintax can assist with amended returns, so if you need to correct your return, you can always go into the Sprintax software and correct a return for a previous year. And that leads nicely into the implications of not filing. It's really, really important to be aware of this because it can impact your visa, can impact your future immigration status. So non-residents are required to comply with all US laws. That includes your IRS filing obligations. So filing tax forms, even if it's just Form 8843, is part of maintaining visa status in the US. As I said, not filing can affect future immigration status. Fines, penalties, and interest can accrue if the IRS are owed. And finally, you might be due a refund. The only way to do that is actually to file a tax return. So do keep this in mind as we look towards the upcoming filing season, which kicks off in late January of 2022. So just to finish things off, using Sprintax for your tax compliance, our software can help with a couple of different areas. Mainly what you'll be looking at here is Sprintax to help with your tax filing preparation. There's also tax compliance and forms, and then there's also a software that can help OPT or CPT employment. So Sprintax tax preparation is a software that prepares your federal and state income tax returns for all of the US income you earned during the year. So when we get to filing season, which will kick off, late January, early February of 2022, this is when you might get information about Sprintax tax preparation from your school to start going through the software to outline your income information and to prepare your income tax returns to send to the IRS or also to send to state tax authorities. You may need to print, sign and mail those returns. Sprintax has launched federal e-filing, so you might be eligible to electronically file your return when tax filing season opens up in 2022. Sprintax TDS, some of you might be using this also at the moment. This is only relevant to some schools who might have this software in place. This is a software that helps you get set up when you're getting employment from the school or if you're getting taxable income like scholarships from the school. So this software will run you through a questionnaire and it will generate your important tax forms related to employment and receipt of US income, like a W4, 8233 or W8BEN. This software can also prepare that 1042S income document at year end, but this will only be relevant to some of you. Many schools might not have TDS in place, so don't worry if you haven't seen or know what TDS is. And finally, the Sprintax TDS personal software. This is a software that helps anyone who's going out on OPT or CPT, so optional practical training or curricular practical training. It helps them to ensure that you're being taxed correctly on your income. So it's a software that you can go in through on by yourself. You'll go through a tax-related questionnaire, and this software will generate your W4, W8BEN, or your 8233 for tax treaty application if you're working with an employer outside of the school. It's separate to any of your tax filing that you might need to do, and you can register for an account on TDS Personal via this link as well. Then in terms of other support, this is going to be really, really helpful to keep an eye on. Do keep an eye on our educational tax videos on the Sprintax YouTube channel. We have a lot of helpful tax videos on our YouTube channel, so do keep that in mind. We do also have tax blogs going out regularly on the Sprintax blog. It covers different areas like cryptocurrency, investments, what to do when it comes to filing season and more. And then when it does come to tax filing season, you can go into Sprintax Tax Prep and there is live chat support on hand during the filing season to help you out. So do keep these in mind. These will be really, really helpful to further educate you on your tax obligations as you start going throughout the year and start learning more about tax. So thanks for virtually staying awake. I know there was maybe a lot of content in that. It might not make 100% sense right now, but I think it may help a lot of you to prepare for the tax filing season ahead and maybe understand a bit more about how the US tax system works and what some tax forms mean. So please feel free to share with us if you found this webinar helpful. We'll try and have a look now through the questions function to see if there's been any common themes, any common questions. I'm sure with the large volume of attendees, we'll have lots of questions. We'll try and cover maybe some of the common themes that we've been seeing.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone for your questions and your engagement throughout. Lots of questions coming in, definitely some common themes. Some students confused, they only arrived, a month back or in early 2021. Do they have a filing requirement right now? So if you've arrived in the US in 2021 and you earn income during the 2021 tax year, you'll be reporting that on your tax return in the 2021 tax season, which will kick off around end of January, early February in 2022. So, you'll receive your income documents, if relevant, towards the end of the tax year or early in 2022, depending on which document you're expecting to receive.
Yeah, it's a good point, and sometimes it might not make a lot of sense. 2021 tax season, figuring that out in 2022. But as Anna mentioned, if you're just arriving now, you're earning income in 2021, you'll start getting your income documents like a W2 or a 1042S or 1099 at the end of the year when all of those payments have been made to you. And what you'll do with those income documents is you'll use that on Sprintax Tax Prep to complete your tax returns to send to the IRS. So tax filing season for 2021 won't open up until the end of January 2022. How to find out if there's a tax treaty benefit that can be availed of. In many cases, your school might have particular software in place that helps to identify if you have a tax treaty. Other way, and it can be a little bit difficult, is to look through the IRS website and look at the tax treaty between your home country and the US. So maybe try and identify on the IRS website to see if there actually is a tax treaty between your home country and the US. But there are a lot of most schools will have a software that will actually do that thinking for you, and it will help you to actually help them to understand and prepare tax treaty forms.
A good question, are there forms I have to hand in when starting a new job, or do I file everything during the tax season? So good question. The forms that Ryan went through at the beginning of the session, Form 8843, your federal tax returns such as the 1040 NR, or any state tax returns that you might need to file, they'll come into effect and they'll be relevant when you're filing your tax return. But if you can make your employer aware of your tax position during the tax year, so before you kick off with employment, that can help to ensure that you're taxed correctly on your income. So we have a system, Sprintax TDS Personal, that can assist with that. You can provide your employer's information, from that then we will ask you questions like around your residency, income information. So the system will figure out what's your residency for tax purposes, are you eligible to claim a tax treaty, should you be paying FICA or not, which Ryan went through earlier on. So making sure that your employer is aware if you should be exempt from FICA or not, and then preparing any pre-employment or pre-withholding forms for you. So the W4 may be relevant. If you have a tax treaty, depending on the income, the W8 Ben or the 8233 may be relevant. So definitely making sure your employer is aware of your tax position and you provide any relevant forms to them can help to ensure you're taxed correctly. And if you're eligible to claim any treaty or reduced rate of tax withholding, that you can do that.
Yeah, I've also seen lots of questions about if I need to file for previous tax years, how do I do that? I showed this screen a little earlier around the amended returns. You can also backfile for the last 3 years here. So you can backfile for 2020, 2019, 2018, or if you want to actually amend a tax return, you would select that you want to correct your previous return. So you can see that here listed. So you can always backfile for previous years for those that do need to file for years previous.
Some questions as well around Form 8843, who needs to file that? And I sent it the 8843, but I didn't get confirmation that it was received. So generally, most non-residents who were present on US soil during the tax year will need to file Form 8843, even if you haven't earned taxable income during the tax year. Essentially, it confirms your non-resident status to the IRS. You generally won't receive any confirmation if Form 8843 has been received. So, don't worry if you haven't received anything, as it's unlikely that you will.
Yeah, a lot of questions coming through on FICA. It looks like some individuals are getting FICA taxes withheld. Should I ask the school to refund me or wait for IRS reimbursement? What I would say is probably have that conversation with your employer. You may, depending on your visa category, the type of visa that you're on. For example, if you're F2 or J2, it's likely that you might actually be subject to FICA taxes. So there may be some of you that are getting FICA taxes withheld correctly, but typically J1 or F1 visa holders that are non-residents for tax purposes are generally exempt from paying FICA. If you're a resident for tax purposes, you might be subject to FICA. H1B, TN, J2 or F2 are also subject to FICA taxes. So it's about maybe having that conversation with your employer to see is FICA taxes being withheld correctly there in that case? It may be the case they're actually withholding it correctly, because schools will generally know not to withhold FICA unless you actually are subject to FICA taxes, but always worth having the conversation.
Question around the ITIN. So I don't have a social security number. Should I be applying for an ITIN? So the ITIN is generally required by an individual who is receiving taxable income during the year and needs to file a federal tax return, but they're not eligible for a social security number. So for example, if you're not working, you can't get a social security number, but you're receiving taxable scholarship during the year and you need to file a federal tax return, you'll likely need an ITIN then. So that ITIN application form is the W7 form, and Ryan mentioned our ITIN blog, which I can send into the chat, which details the process in detail and how to go about applying for an ITIN.
Yeah, what are the implications for spouses or dependents? For example, an F2 or J2 spouse who's unemployed. Do they need to do anything? So essentially, if you're still a non-resident for tax purposes on that F or J visa, or generally F, J, M, or Q for the most part, you would generally need to file Form 8843 at a minimum if you didn't receive US source income but were present as a non-resident for tax purposes as an exempt individual during 2021. So if, let's say, you were present as a non-resident for tax purposes on an F2 or a J2, for example, you didn't earn any income, you still will likely need to file Form 8843. Dependents, children, if they're on that same visa, it's tied to the visa and not necessarily age. So they would also need to have a Form 8843 sent to the IRS. And the important thing there is you don't need a tax identification number if you just need to file Form 8843 with the IRS.
A couple of questions around individuals who are waiting for their refunds, submitting in March or May and still no update on the status of their tax refund. Should I worry or should I resubmit? So first of all, don't panic, you're definitely not alone. There's a large backlog of tax returns. The IRS are still working through them. There was a large backlog in May, even before the tax filing deadline came in July. So don't worry, the IRS are certainly working through that backlog, but you can definitely expect longer wait times than in prior tax seasons. You can check on the status of your refund on the IRS website, irs.gov/refunds. But what I would say is that there are expected delays in processing the returns and the refunds.
Yeah, a lot of questions on refunds, like you said there, Anna. The last 2 years have been so unorthodox given the pandemic. Given the IRS literally, having their offices closed. There's also been some weather issues that have impacted their offices in Texas over the last filing season. So they are playing serious catch up. So I think there's certainly a large amount of tax returns that are still being processed at the moment as we speak for both residents and non-residents. So that's why we're seeing delays in refunds being issued. But what I would say there is try and stay patient. You can use the irs.gov/refunds option to look for an update on your tax refund status.
Question around Sprintax. What sort of assistance can Sprintax provide to me if this is the first year I'll be filing my tax returns? So firstly, I'd say keep an eye on your communications from your school or your university, and perhaps from your international office. They may send communications closer to the tax season, so likely at the beginning of 2022, perhaps with links or access to Sprintax. On the Sprintax system, we have a comprehensive user-friendly questionnaire that you'll be brought through. If there's anything you're unsure of as you go through the system, we do have live chat available on the system, so that's available 24/7 once the tax season kicks off. So from first day of tax season right up until the tax filing deadline, our live chat will be there around the clock to help. And we do have a support email, hello@sprintax.com as well. Ryan mentioned our blog as well. which is updated very regularly throughout the tax season and throughout the year. So keep an eye on that, and also keep an eye out for any future webinars that are shared with you from your school or university as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see a lot of FICA questions coming through, folks who are getting FICA taxes withheld with their F1 visas. So there may be some folks who are on OPT or CPT. What I would say there is the first thing to do if you have had FICA taxes withheld in error is to approach your employer and ask for the employer to refund those taxes back. If the employer refuses, you can use Sprintax to also prepare a FICA return, which is called Form 843 and 8316, if you need to actually apply for the refund of FICA taxes directly from the IRS. So they're probably your two best options there.
Yeah. Questions around scholarships. So some individuals receiving a scholarship or a fellowship, and they're wondering if that's taxable. So if your scholarship just covers your tuition or tuition related expenses, generally that's going to be non-taxable and non-reportable on your tax return. Scholarship for anything outside of tuition, such as room and board, or if you received a stipend or you scholarship towards travel or anything like that, that's typically going to be taxable and reportable on your tax return. So important to keep that in mind, that scholarships can be taxable when outside of tuition.
Yeah, there's also cases where folks are getting Amazon gift cards or gift cards for participating in games or focus groups. I suppose, unfortunately, there is no personal exemption for, well, the personal exemption is zero for non-residents. So as soon as you earn any taxable US source income, it will trigger a federal filing requirement for non-residents. So we've seen folks who have received $50 or $100 in Amazon gift cards. Essentially, you would need to report that on your tax return and on Sprintax.
There were also a lot of questions earlier in the session around receiving income from outside the US. So investment income from outside the US or a scholarship from outside the US. So typically, if you are a non-resident for tax purposes and you receive such income from outside the US, that's generally going to be foreign sourced income and non-taxable, non-reportable for you in the US. However, if you're a resident for tax purposes, that would change and you're typically taxed on your worldwide income. But for non-residents, you'd be looking at your US sourced income.
I think we've covered a lot of the main topics. What I have outlined here is that we do have our support features outlined on the screen here. You can always set up an account on Sprintax and use the live chat facility if you need additional assistance. We do also have our email support, which is hello@sprintax.com. And then also, what I would say is with regards to tax filing season, it's very likely you won't receive a whole lot of communication from your school about tax filing season until we get into probably early 2022. But this is here to educate you on what tax filing requirements you might have when we get to early 2022, when filing season opens up. And also help anyone who's about to start employment or receiving US source income. So we certainly hope that you learned some useful information from today. And thanks to everyone for tuning in as well. It's been great to see such a high engagement rate, even so early in this year.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone. And just for anyone asking for the recording, you'll receive it tomorrow to your email address that you registered for the session for. And lastly, anyone who wants to download the slides, they're available as a handout in your control panel. So feel free to just click onto them and download them if you want to keep them for future use. But again, thanks for everyone for joining. It was great to have such big numbers at this point in the year.
Absolutely. And we see some familiar names, I think, from some of our school partners. So thanks for joining and sharing with your population. Thanks everyone again, and we hope the session was helpful. Have a great rest of your day.
Enjoy the rest of your day.